By now, the best weather for offensive operations in Ukraine in 2023 has well and truly passed. The hard ground and warm temperatures of summer have now been replaced by mud and a march towards the snow and cold of the Ukrainian winter. By this part of the year, I expected to be doing an after-the-fact evaluation of Ukraine's offensive in Zaporizhzhia and talking about two opposing exhausted armies pivoting their focus towards force regeneration ahead of a potential uptick in offensive activity either during the winter or next year's campaign season. Instead, in some places we've actually seen an uptick in offensive activity, with Ukraine launching actions across the Great Dnipro River near Kherson, and Russia gathering up tens of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, and throwing basically the whole bloody thing at Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka. Because I suppose if Ukraine was going to have a costly offensive in 2023, Russia was going to have to try to have a potentially even more expensive one of its own. The opening stages of that offensive hit the operational and tactical equivalents of a double brick wall, and while still very much ongoing and a great threat to the Ukrainian defenders, has driven 2023's greatest spike in observed Russian losses, and gone so well that the official Russian MOD position seems to be to basically not talk about it. So today, instead of evaluating past offensives, we're mostly going to be focusing on currently active ones. We're going to break out the satellite images, spreadsheets, and graphs to demonstrate just how expensive some of these recent offensives have been, and ask what these actions might tell us about the opposing forces and the fighting to come. To do that, I'm going to cover a couple of points in sequence. First, I'll ask what both sides were probably trying to achieve over the course of this year's campaign season, and give a very quick update on Ukrainian actions in Zaporizhzhia. Then we'll get into the heart of the episode looking at two very different ongoing offensive actions. The first being Ukraine's cross-river activities in Kherson, and the other Russia's attempt at a combined arms offensive in Avdiivka. There I'm going to try not to focus too much on individual movements or engagements. Instead, I'm going to try to give the big picture and then pivot into some loss analysis, looking at what some of the data that came out of this year's offensives is telling us about how expensive these actions are and what the state of the two opposing forces might be. Having calculated exactly how many BMPs and tanks it takes to capture a giant waste pile around Avdiivka, we'll then have a look at some qualitative observations about the nature of the fighting, obviously a lot of which will be anecdotal, and close out with some high-level observations. But before we jump into it, there is a word from a sponsor, and today I'm once again welcoming back a returning sponsor, Private Internet Access. For most of us in the modern world, there's probably no way to 100% protect our privacy. Most of us need to regularly interact with corporations or governments that will request our personal data, and if you're watching this video, you obviously use the internet. So you might decide at least some precautions are in order. In a sense, you might compare using the internet with no precautions, and particularly if you regularly use unsecured public networks, to buying a used car sight unseen without a mechanical inspection. Most of the time things might turn out fine, or you might discover you've made a significant mistake. A VPN like mechanical inspection might not eliminate risk, but it may be a tool to mitigate some of them. With a single click, a VPN can allow you to reroute your internet traffic, change your publicly noted IP address, and help to protect your privacy online. Because when it comes to any data, including logs of your internet traffic, it's pretty hard to compromise something that doesn't exist. And Private Internet Access are pretty clear that they have a no-logs policy that has been tested in court and subject to audit. It's also worth noting the app is both open source and available across multiple platforms, all while giving you the flexibility to connect to VPN servers in 84 different countries worldwide and across all 50 US states. Plus, Private Internet Access advertises compatibility with a range of streaming services. And while traveling, I've hit the button to connect to a streaming-optimized server more than once. Also, unlike some of those streaming services, a single subscription with Private Internet Access allows you to cover an unlimited number of devices. Now, of course, we are in the Black Friday sale season right now. Usually a pretty good time to hunt for discounts on just about anything. If you click the link in the description, you can read up a little more about the product and access a range of offers, including a pretty significant 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months. That subscription is covered by a 30-day money-back guarantee, and critically, as I said earlier, covers an unlimited number of devices. Okay, so if we're talking about offensives ongoing and past in 2023, it's probably worth giving a quick refresher on what both sides were probably trying to achieve with their various actions over the course of the year. For Ukraine, the goals were very clearly and publicly telegraphed. Seize the initiative on the battlefield, launch a major offensive against Russian forces in the south of Ukraine, retake Tokmak, problematize Russian logistics across the south, and if possible, push on further, cutting the Russian land bridge to Kherson and Crimea. For Russia, obviously containing Ukraine's offensive was going to be a key objective, but I think there was plenty of reason to suggest that that wasn't the only objective. When it comes to Russia's battlefield objectives, there are at least two schools of thought. In its public statements, despite everything that has happened so far, Russian political figures, in public at least, have been adamant their war goals still, at minimum, include the full annexation of Zaporizhzhia Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. And a lot of that claimed territory isn't currently under Russian control. From there, the different schools of thought on how Russia might try and achieve those objectives come into play. For example, some might argue that all Russia really has to do is just hang on long enough, and eventually the West will get tired, Ukraine will collapse, and Russia will get at the negotiating table what it couldn't get on the battlefield. Because historically, obviously crossing your fingers and hoping the opposing side collapses has never gone wrong for any planner ever. Alternatively, there's a school of thought that says for Russia, being on the defensive isn't enough. That for reasons, including political reasons at home and abroad, they have to attempt further advances in Ukraine. And if they are going to try and advance anywhere, Donetsk, and by extension places like Avdiivka, are probably a pretty logical place to start. In part because if you're trying to sell the narrative that your invasion was to protect the Donbass, it's kind of hard to declare it successful if you don't actually control the Donbass. So even if Russia had major defensive objectives in 2023, I think it's also reasonable to expect that figures like Putin would have been pushing strongly for further offensive action. So with that context in place, before we jump into Kherson or Russia's accelerated vehicle decommissioning program around Avdiivka, I do think we need to provide a quick update on where things have settled with the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhzhia. Here I won't dwell for too long because we covered the topic back in October. At that point, we noted that the Ukrainian offensive had faced extreme difficulties from things like defensive Russian minefields, that Ukraine had long adjusted its tactics to minimise losses at the expense of moving much, much slower, and with Russian airborne forces committed to hold the front facing Verbove, it looked very much like even though Ukraine's offensive had broken into some of these Surovikin line defences, the effort would ultimately fall short of its stated minimal geographic goal, reaching Tokmak. Now, with competing demands for resources at other points along the line, and with changing seasonal conditions changing the difficulty level for any ongoing offensive in the area from hard to insane, noting of course that real-world military operations are always played on Iron Man mode, it seems almost certain now that that's exactly where the Ukrainian offensive has settled. Offensive actions are still very much being fought, and the Ukrainians seem content to slowly gnaw away at Russian defences, position by position, tree line by tree line. But as you can see, mud season is very much a reality. The local roads aren't exactly the autobahn, and so attacks or counterattacks in the near future are likely to be both local, slow-moving, and limited in scope to what local logistics and force availability can support. While it's always possible that something insane will happen, I think it's fair now to say the Ukrainian offensive has not reached its objective in the south, and is extremely unlikely to do so, at least in 2023. In terms of trying to understand why things played out the way they did, different commentators, politicians, or interest groups have put forward different theories. But one thought that I think does need to be addressed here, because it has relevance to the way the other offensives we're going to talk about have played out, and probably will continue to play out, and that is to what extent did material matter, as opposed to soft factors like planning, communication, the ability to coordinate, and other aspects that help shape how the Ukrainian military planned and fought. You might, for example, see this idea expressed if someone says Ukraine received everything they needed for the offensive, and it was some other factor that resulted in Ukraine not reaching its objectives. Personally, I think that the evidence available suggests that yes, those soft factors are incredibly important, and the Ukrainian military probably needs to take lessons learned, continue to adapt, and try and build its capabilities. But I also think there's a lot of evidence that material, how much stuff you have, correlates with outcomes. Storm Shadow proved, for example, that it could damage bridges and hit logistics nodes. But Ukraine clearly never had enough of them for it to be economical to continuously suppress those lines of logistics. ATACMS, when it arrived, clearly worked, making life really difficult for Russian attack helicopters, which themselves had made a significant contribution to the Russian defence in the opening days and weeks of Ukraine's offensive. But the missiles came both very late and in very limited quantities. The list could go on, talking about air defence systems, artillery ammunition, armoured vehicles, mine-clearing equipment, etc. The point is, however brave or motivated a force in Ukraine might be, it's going to do better, all else being equal, if it has a lot of stuff at hand, as opposed to having to make do with nothing but stubbornness and esprit de corps. In any case, the significant reduction in Ukrainian offensive operations in Zaporizhzhia probably left something of an opening for either side looking to seize the initiative. Russian and Ukrainian commanders had the option to go onto the attack or focus on the defensive and force regeneration. Both, as it turned out, seemed to have chosen a little of column A and a little of column B, leaving us with a series of attacks and counterattacks all across the front, with two particular areas of interest to look at today, with the first being Ukraine's increasingly brazen operations across the Dnipro River against the Russian-occupied left bank in Kherson. Now, the first thing to say here is that Ukrainian raiding activity across the Dnipro River is not exactly a new phenomenon. Almost from the time the Russians withdrew behind the river, abandoning the city of Kherson, and certainly before the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, we had plenty of reports and supporting evidence of Ukrainian special forces in particular conducting raids across the river. But at the end of the day, these Ukrainian operations do seem to have been limited in both scale and ambition. Even some of the pro-Russian sources I went through estimated that the group that was sheltering under the Antonovsky was no more than 70 personnel. Recently, however, that scope of Ukrainian ambition appears to have been steadily expanding. Ukrainian Marines and other service personnel now hold a number of positions on the left/south bank of the river, and have so far stubbornly resisted all Russian attempts to throw them back across. It's worth noting two critical points here before we continue. If we zoom out, however, we can make some observations about why the Ukrainians might be choosing to try and fight here. In terms of strategic and political imperative, obviously the city of Kherson is just there. Ever since Ukraine reclaimed the city, it's often come under artillery attack from Russian forces. So it stands to reason if Ukraine is able to push Russian forces several kilometres further away, then Kherson's people and valuable infrastructure will become harder to target, as shorter-ranged Russian artillery systems in particular have to get closer to the new front line in order to make those attacks. The presence of the city is also one part in the wider logistics context here. The general quality of infrastructure on the Ukrainian-controlled right bank of the river is considerably better than the quality on the Russian-controlled left bank. There are permanent roads that can be expected to handle mud season and winter relatively well, and of course Kherson itself is a major settlement with an active railway connection. That means if Ukraine wants to move units around or keep the units that are currently engaged well supplied with things like artillery ammunition, then they have a relatively simple, in comparative terms, way to do it. Obviously things get much more complicated if you want to move equipment across the river itself as opposed to just to Kherson, but the relevant infrastructure on the Russian side isn't quite so extensive. The area is basically, to use the technical term, at the arse end of the Russian logistics network. Most supplies are either going to have to transit from Russia through Zaporizhzhia all the way to Kherson, or come up from Crimea. And to that, you can add the fact that there are parts of the terrain in this region that are basically hostile to the very concept of logistics. You can see on that satellite image, for example, Leshki Sands, a national park, which I imagine is aesthetically a 10 out of 10 if you're a tourist wanting to see desert terrain in Eastern Europe, but about a 1 out of 10 if you're trying to run efficient ammunition convoys. And then, because if the logistics guys are being punished, the troops should too, Kherson has yet more presence in favour if you happen to be playing the red team here. The territory on the Ukrainian side is generally more elevated, meaning they literally have the high ground. So even though the river itself obviously creates a significant natural barrier between the two sides, in any protracted fight over that river, then in any scenario where at least the most logistically intensive Ukrainian assets, like for example their artillery, can remain on the right bank, then they're likely going to be fighting with at least some advantages they can leverage over the Russian defenders. However, it's easy to imagine that situation inverting if at any point Ukraine becomes too successful. The fundamental point here is that moving stuff in volume across a river like this without permanent bridge infrastructure is a slow process, a difficult process, and a vulnerable process. At the moment, Ukraine mostly has to move infantry and some supporting vehicles across the river and sustain them there. Meanwhile, Ukrainian air defences, counter-artillery radar systems and the Ukrainian artillery itself, most of their heavy equipment in fact, can remain on the right bank. Were the Russians to lose ground, however, eventually you'd reach the point where Ukraine would have to move those assets and things like electronic warfare systems across the water barrier, while Russia's logistical lines would shorten and they'd eventually reach easier terrain to defend. So while it might be reasonable to expect that Ukraine can fight quite well close to the Dnipro while economising its own use of force, all else being equal, the more successful the operation is in taking territory, arguably the harder it might become. And operating without electronic warfare, anti-air defences or artillery is obviously a bit of a non-starter, because while Russian logistics in Kherson do not exactly appear to be ideal, there have been plenty of reports of them leveraging other assets, particularly aviation, in order to counterbalance the success that Ukraine is having with its artillery, drones, etc. Now, after the extremely damaging Ukrainian ATACMS strikes against Russian air bases at Berdyansk and in Luhansk, there was some reporting that jumped from many Russian helicopters being destroyed to all the Russian helicopters being destroyed or neutralised. Instead, what we can observe is that while the Kar-52 and similar attack helicopter fleets may be significantly depleted from where they were in February 2022, they still exist and they're still very dangerous. What you're looking at here is satellite imagery of an airbase in Russia, with markings by Front Intelligence Insights, showing at least 4 Kar-52 attack helicopters that have not yet gone through an ATACMS-induced ventilation upgrade. And obviously, there are many other bases and many other types of attack helicopter, which even if they're not individually as capable as the Kar-52, are still compatible with a range of Russian weapon systems and can still be very dangerous. And with Ukraine's supply of ATACMS missiles extremely limited, the ability to hit these targets regularly is obviously very constrained. What the Ukrainian strikes do appear to have accomplished is the damage or destruction of a large number of Russian helicopters, we've talked about that in the past, while also making it much more dangerous for Russia to concentrate large numbers of helicopters at airbases inside occupied Ukrainian territory. But with Ukraine promising not to use systems like ATACMS against Russian territory, simply moving them across the border back into recognised Russian territory is basically the same as having a 100% impenetrable missile shield. Students of history here might recall the concept of MiG Alley during the Korean War, where MiG-15 fighters flying from Chinese airbases into Korea were fair game as long as they were operating in Korea, but were not allowed to be attacked at their airbases or in Chinese airspace by United Nations pilots. And then to enable strikes against the front lines, because obviously Russia is a long way from places like Kherson, the reporting and a couple of very low resolution images I've seen suggest that what the Russians have done is started making greater use of forward arming and refueling points, or FARPs. A FARP is a fancy name for what is usually just a section of field. You bring in trucks carrying munitions, fuel, the maintenance personnel and their tools, and you use this temporary location to rearm and refuel helicopters operating close to the front line, before dispersing the entire thing before opposing ISR can identify you and lock long-range fires onto your position. This is not going to be as efficient for generating sorties or maintaining platforms than operating from a permanent airbase, but it's still probably better than seeing a 90% chance of submunitions on the next day's weather forecast. The other important aviation asset which hasn't been constrained by the introduction of things like ATACMS is Russia's fixed-wing aviation. And here, because you're often dealing with quite small Ukrainian bridgeheads that might not always be able to fully disperse themselves, we have seen extensive use of Russian glide bombs in the 500 to 1500 kilogram categories. So far, that obviously hasn't been anywhere near enough to actually stop the Ukrainians undertaking these operations, but it does give Russian ground forces in the region a crutch of sorts that they can lean on to help compensate for Ukraine's various advantages. So with Russia having the advantage in the air and a major water barrier in the form of the Dnipro River, while Ukraine has localized advantages in at the very least logistics, and also I would argue things like troop quality, drone operators, and the accuracy of artillery fire, where does that likely leave the Ukrainian operations in Kherson going forward? The big caveat to put here is that the outcomes could change massively if either side decided to dedicate significant additional forces to it. Compared to some of the other efforts we've talked about, all signs point to Kherson being a bit of an economy of force operation to an extent for both sides. The Ukrainians have some Marine brigades there, which obviously represent quality troops and a number of supporting arms. But in terms of the overall scale of the operation as we've seen so far, it's rather small compared to, for example, Russian offensives around Avdiivka or the main Ukrainian summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia. The most likely outcomes seem to be continued Ukrainian offensive operations on the nominally Russian-occupied side of the river. But where exactly and what that looks like is still highly contingent. If the Russians decide they want to more or less defend right up to the river, reinforce, continue deploying aviation, and are able to contain or even throw back some of the Ukrainian bridgeheads, then the fighting might remain right up against the river or on the islands of the river, but at the cost of Russia dedicating forces to what probably aren't optimal defensive positions and committing resources they'd probably prefer to have elsewhere. That sounds like a recipe for accepting more attrition in exchange for not giving Ukraine any sort of political win. By contrast, a degree of Russian withdrawal might actually put their defending troops in a better position and force the Ukrainians to make difficult decisions about what assets they pull across the river and how. But it would mean giving territory and with it something of a political win to the Ukrainians, and potentially run the risk of the situation escalating in future if the Ukrainians were, for example, able to re-establish some bridging infrastructure over the Dnipro. On the flip side, too large a Ukrainian force on the wrong side of the river might be a recipe for potential overextension and problems that could flow from there. The basic summary is that for now, Ukraine seems to have every reason to continue to poke and prod in Kherson, and while there's a lot of uncertainty over what the outcome looks like in the immediate future, it likely includes Russia remaining primarily on the defensive, and the city of Kherson itself, once declared forever Russian, remaining very much in Ukrainian hands as a vital logistics centre. But while Ukraine has pushed in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson in the south and places like Bakhmut in the east, the Russian armed forces have never been engaged in purely static defence. They've launched numerous attacks at multiple points along the front, mostly without success, and then, just in the last month, massively escalated their efforts around one Ukrainian settlement. This is a place we've talked about before, Avdiivka. In some ways, it's very impressive that the Ukrainian position in Avdiivka exists at all. Avdiivka is a settlement in the Donetsk region so close to the regional capital of Donetsk itself that it's sometimes referred to as being a suburb. Pre-2014, it had a population of approximately 30,000 and was then seized briefly by Russian-backed forces in that year. It was, however, retaken by Ukrainian forces that same year, and from then until now remained very much a frontline location. Extensive fortifications were prepared facing the contact line, and the settlement itself also has a number of defensible positions. In particular, Avdiivka is home to a coking plant, which is a sturdily built industrial facility, and all of this might help explain why, in February 2022, when Russian forces rolled across the border, and many Ukrainian positions buckled as the Russians advanced, the defenders of Avdiivka, presumably declaring that they hadn't heard no bell, dug in and held. The fact that as of November, Avdiivka is still in Ukrainian hands is not for lack of trying on the part of the Russians. Geographically, Avdiivka's position is very annoying if you happen to be a Russian military planner determined to take all of the Donbass. It's an enemy position right on the doorstep of a major city and logistical centre that also happens to be standing in the way of a potential line of advance. And so there were a number of attempts to attack or encircle Avdiivka, to the point that during the battle for Bakhmut, I saw a number of pro-Russian commentators suggest that Avdiivka might actually fall before Bakhmut did. But Avdiivka, like other Ukrainian positions in places like Marinka, has demonstrated a way of not falling even when the narrative says it should. And so by the time we got to October 2023, more than a year and a half after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Avdiivka and some of the surrounding terrain essentially formed a Ukrainian salient. To the east and the west, Russian and pro-Russian forces had advanced past it. And while there was still an understanding the Russians might want to take the location in the future, one of the more common predictions I saw, reading material put out by a number of Western commentators, was that in the aftermath of Ukraine's offensive efforts, Russia would probably focus on force regeneration, preparing itself to potentially launch a major offensive either during the winter or in early 2024. What generally wasn't expected was for Russia to gather a number of its reserves together and throw an army-scaled mechanised offensive into the teeth of Avdiivka's defences in an attempt to once again encircle it. But for all of the Russian capabilities, equipment and adaptations that I keep trying to remind people exist, at the end of the day, it is still admittedly the Russian army, so slamming a mechanised force into those defences is exactly what they've done. The offensive appears to have kicked off in earnest on the 10th of October, with forces pushing both to the north and south of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians reported dozens of Russian airstrikes per day, actions by Russian helicopters, and the Russian MOD reinforced a lot of that reporting with statements as to its own strike activity. It was clear, even after the first few days, that Russian mechanised losses had been horrible. Just a few days in, we saw the first Western observers saying the attacks couldn't possibly continue due to the rate of losses, so of course they continued until at least the 16th. There then appears to have been a few days of offensive but less intense offensive activity, but attacks would pick up again on the 18th, and that would basically set the pace for the month to come. Units would go forward, potentially make some progress while being horrendously chewed up. There would be a brief reset, and a new unit would continue the push, potentially trying slightly different tactics. From the Ukrainian defenders, we saw some of what have become the typical drivers of heavy casualties during offensives like this one. There were minefields, of course, but also the employment of cluster artillery ammunition against mass targets, including large infantry formations in the open, the extensive deployment of FPV drones, particularly against vehicles moving up towards the front lines, as well as tanks being used in both the indirect and direct fire roles. While I don't want to oversell the point, the composition of the attacking forces and the tactics used did visually change from the point of view of observers day by day. Massed mechanised assaults would lead to massed mechanised casualties, which might in turn lead to actions being less mechanised until a unit that still had more of its equipment available was moved up to the line. And if the Russian goal had been a relatively quick double envelopment, something we obviously can't prove, then the scale of the tactical objectives clearly became smaller quickly. For example, continuing the tradition begun with the Great Campaign for the Bakhmut garbage dump, a lot of fighting would take place over a pile of coal tailings just north of Avdiivka. This was the Terikon, which would give any defenders a significant advantage in terms of height and observation, but at the same time, because it is literally made of coal tailings, wasn't a particularly good place to dig in with no obvious cover. Every campaign in this war tends to generate footage which is pretty confronting to watch. And if you're looking for my nomination of footage to avoid when it comes to Avdiivka, it's probably the recordings of individual troops trying to climb up the side of the mound and never making it to the top. Eventually, after multiple failed results and essentially demolishing all Ukrainian positions on the mound, Russian assault units eventually established themselves on the Terikon, only to find themselves then fighting to hold it against constant fire harassment, given there wasn't exactly a plethora of places to easily dig in on the mound and no easy way to supply it. If you want to understand just how symbolic this waste pile became at a local level, the Russians eventually put a flag up on the Terikon, which was then blown up by a Ukrainian FPV drone. While obviously not a hugely utilitarian employment of military resources on either side, I think it does give you some indication as to just how determined both the attacker and the defender were, because by the time that flag went up, the Russian attackers had suffered horrendous casualties, but new men and units continued to be fed in, and the offensive continued. With one of the main changes over time being that as mechanised losses mounted, Russian offensive actions leaned more and more on continuous infantry assaults supported by things like aerial bombing, as opposed to the waves of metal that we saw earlier on. What you're looking at on screen now is the Deep State map evaluation of the situation around Avdiivka on the 2nd of October and the 23rd of November respectively. In the south, the movements could mostly be measured in metres, machinery and manpower. But in the north, that distance you can see marked on the map there between the Russian start line and the area just past the waste heap represents a distance of just over 2 kilometres. As at time of recording, the Russian offensive has not encircled Avdiivka, nor taken significant locations within the settlement itself. What it has done, however, is grind its way forward to reach the north-south rail line, thus essentially cutting off one of the 2 main directions by which supplies can be brought into Avdiivka. When we go through the loss data a little bit later, I want you to keep that map in mind so you can understand better the correlation between casualties and conquered territory. As we start asking, in a very World War I style fashion, what exactly the price of a mile is around this particular objective. But what if you want to look at official Russian MOD sources and see what they're saying about their offensive in Avdiivka? Well, the answer, for those of you who follow those daily updates, is basically, what offensive? If you read the Russian releases on the fighting in the Donetsk region, then you'd be forgiven for thinking that not only is there no offensive ongoing, it's the Ukrainians that are actually on the attack. For the period 7 to 13 October, the initial stages of the Russian push, the Russian MOD summarised the fighting in Donetsk by saying that it had repelled 17 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces near Vasilivka and Bodyane. That report made no mention of Russian advances, even though it described forward movements in other regions. But you know what? Hey, maybe there was just a delay in information, a news lag. So we can jump forward to the report for 18 to 24 November, and what do we see? The fighting in Donetsk described as the Russians repelling 22 enemy attacks and inflicting losses near Marinka, Kadymivka, Artyomovsk, so Bakhmut, Andriivka and Klishivka. This is a very different approach to the one taken, for example, during the battle for Bakhmut, where seemingly Wagner troops couldn't move 10 metres forward without the Russian MOD claiming the paratroopers had won a tremendous victory. Now obviously there could be a lot of factors at play here, but at a cursory level, it looks like so far the Russian MOD is so happy with the results of the Avdiivka offensive that they've largely decided to instead describe it as a series of Ukrainian attacks that are of course destroyed with precision and panache by superior Russian firepower. But all that being said, I still think it's worth sounding a very significant note of caution about the situation in Avdiivka. Yes, the Russians have burned through a tremendous amount of men and material, advancing a relatively short distance. And yes, bad weather, challenging logistics and heavy losses have made it difficult for Russia to hold on to toeholds in Avdiivka when it's able to secure them. But the nature of this Avdiivka salient is that they also don't have to advance that much further for the situation to become potentially untenable for the Ukrainians. The reason I say that is because of the supply line situation. The north-south link is now very much under direct Russian control, and on that map I've circled 2 locations, the Avdiivka coal facility and the village of Stopove. Were the Russians to take both those locations and continue moving west, you can imagine them making it very, very difficult for Ukraine to move supplies into Avdiivka by those remaining western road links. That's obviously not as simple as it sounds, in part because the Russians have their own supply lines to worry about, keeping their assault units in the north resupplied, despite Ukrainian FPV attacks, for example. But having basically crawled this far already, it's not that much further to make the situation in Avdiivka even more difficult. And I say more difficult because Ukraine already faces the challenge of trying to move enough supplies along those roads during Ukraine's terrific winter mud season triathlon that the next couple of months traditionally bring. In some ways, you might argue the initial Russian advances are a bit of a tragedy for the Russian units involved. If the whole offensive had gone nowhere, not gained a single metre, it's possible it would have been called off already. But here, someone looking at a map is going to see they're not that far from taking a few potentially valuable objectives. And so even though we've seen a transition to more infantry in attacks as opposed to mechanised elements, the offensives are likely to continue. And indeed, as I was recording this, Ukrainian reports started to come out saying that Russia had renewed its offensives in Avdiivka once more. How far any push ultimately manages to go remains to be seen, but I think it's a fair assumption to make whether you measure the advance in centimetres or kilometres, it's going to be costly. And that massive focus that Russia is placing on Avdiivka has subsequently prompted many commentators to ask the question of whether the town is actually worth the material being dedicated against it. The line I have often heard and read is that Avdiivka is a location of no strategic value, and this is just the stupid Russians wasting all their resources over something that isn't important. On that point, I think I humbly have to disagree. It is possible to believe at the same time, I think, both that Russian offensives here have been very costly and wasteful, but also that there is a reason to make Avdiivka an objective and that it does have some value to them. And some of the reasons I say that are very similar to the ones we gave for the Ukrainian actions in Kherson. Avdiivka is a Ukrainian salient right up against the city of Donetsk. That means short of fighting a battle in the suburbs of Moscow, something I think the Ukrainians would volunteer for but the Russians wouldn't be too keen on, fighting around Avdiivka is about as easy as Russian logistics are going to get. The rail link, logistics infrastructure and storage facilities of Donetsk are right there. You have a massive city which you can use to conceal the build-up of men and material before you launch an offensive, and command, control, coordination, reinforcement activities like that are going to be easier. When your central hub is so close to the front line, you're one step away from having commanders stick their head out the window and yell in order to successfully transmit orders to the front. That's obviously an exaggeration, but this is a far cry from operations in Kherson or Zaporizhzhia. So whatever issues Russia might sometimes have with things like logistics, they're going to be mitigated fighting at Avdiivka. Plus, there has since February last year been immense political pressure to push the Ukrainians out of this position for exactly the same reason, because it's so proximate to the city of Donetsk. As long as the Ukrainians hold it, even relatively light artillery weapons can be used against Donetsk proper. And were the war as a whole ever to swing significantly into Ukraine's favour, Avdiivka might be a decent base for Ukrainian actions against that city. Flip that around, and if Russia manages to take Avdiivka, it has a new line of potential advance into the Donbass proper. And while there are schools of thought that say the Russians can do perfectly well in this war by simply sitting and waiting for Ukraine to get tired, my interpretation so far, based on the actions they've taken, that Putin probably hasn't given up on the idea of taking the entire Donbass as part of his minimum war goals, before trying to freeze or finalise the conflict, only to potentially take another go at Ukraine in a number of years. And if you take the view that in order to achieve its objectives in Ukraine, Russia has to go forward, then one of the places it probably wants to go forward, especially now in a universe where it doesn't have Liman and that northern path into Donetsk, then Russia would probably very much prefer it if Avdiivka stopped it with the whole Kadia impression and finally rolled over. So in the end, whether you think Avdiivka is worth it for the Russians probably comes down to two things. Firstly, whether they're actually able to take it, because if not, this whole thing moves into the catastrophe column. Carrying out an army-level mechanised offensive that deploys an enormous amount of manpower, material and munitions, only to accomplish the operational equivalent of running face-first into a double brick wall, probably accomplishes very little other than making sure that military history students in the future have something to include in their essays alongside the Battle of Volodar. If they take it, however, then the question becomes, was it worth it? And your answer to that question ultimately comes down to two factors: how much you value the strategic and operational significance of Avdiivka, and how much you assess the Russian and Ukrainian military to have lost fighting over it. Because make no mistake, when it comes to visually confirmed losses, Avdiivka has probably earned a place in the Russian Invasion Hall of Fame, alongside the likes of Volodar or the retreat from Liman. But those are obviously just qualitative assessments and comments, and I know a lot of you came here for the statistics and the assessment. So using the admittedly very imperfect loss data that we have available to us, let's have a look at what the loss picture around Avdiivka might have looked like, how that compares to the wider war and other engagements, and what the significance of it might be. Now, those of you who followed the channel for a while might be sick of me putting caveats up front and talking about how difficult this sort of assessment can be. So it might surprise you when I say, even though it's still pretty difficult, there are things that make assessing losses around Avdiivka considerably easier than other engagements. Firstly, it's both a relatively small and quite open geographical area, which makes it more financially viable for us to rely on commercial satellite imagery. It's just a smaller area to visually survey, and it's much cheaper if you're a custom imagery addict like I am, a habit which I'll note is primarily enabled by my very generous patrons. Satellite imagery is really useful for doing things like confirming geolocation, and also responding to claims that vehicles might be a duplicate. If someone claims that destroyed vehicle B is just destroyed vehicle A dragged somewhere else and then rephotographed, well, you can pull up the imagery, and if vehicle A is still where it's meant to be at the same time that vehicle B appears on the satellite image, well, short of the deployment of some sci-fi holofield technology, you're probably looking at two different vehicles. This is also an area where the front lines move very, very slowly, to the point of being borderline static in most places. And what that means is you can remove some of the usual uncertainty over who a destroyed vehicle might have belonged to. Because one of the frequent objections you'll see to many visually confirmed lost databases is the claim that, you know what, that destroyed vehicle isn't a Russian tank, it's a Ukrainian tank that they subsequently painted a giant Z on and photographed and claimed it was a Russian one. But in Avdiivka, when you see a vehicle being destroyed or knocked out, 1, 2, 3 or more kilometres behind the relatively known front line, well, it's probably relatively safe to assume that Pavel and his mates didn't take their tank 4Ks into Russian territory, turn it around to point towards the Ukrainian lines, fire a couple of rounds, and then abandon it. Instead, knowing the geography of where a vehicle is destroyed can usually enable us to be pretty confident about who was controlling it when it was destroyed. And the final element, probably the biggest one when you compare this to the assessment difficulties we faced during the Battle of Bakhmut, for example, is that especially when you're talking about some of these more open areas that were fought over by the Russian mechanized pincers, what you're looking at here are mechanized actions, not dismounted infantry actions. And the morbid reality is, it's just much easier to count, track, and verify destroyed equipment than it is to count bodies. In Bakhmut, we saw lots of primarily Wagner-led infantry actions in an urban environment against a dug-in, largely infantry-based defender, and so there was room for both sides to claim massively disparate casualty numbers for themselves or the other side, and we had very little external evidence to clarify or control for that. We could make our best guesses, but the evidence was limited. In Avdiivka, by contrast, we've got more of an analytical smoking gun in the form of smoking BMPs and tanks. And so even just a couple of days after the Russian offensives really took off in early October, you had observers like the team over at Front Intelligence Insights breaking out the geospatial imagery and beginning to count the cost. And in fact, as the battle has played out, there's actually been another element which has come in to again make assessment easier. And that is that at least some of the Ukrainian troops fighting around Avdiivka, specifically the 47th Mechanized, use a lot of NATO standard equipment. So yes, while normally you might have an argument over whether a destroyed BMP-1 is a Russian or Ukrainian BMP-1, no one has yet tried to convince me, when looking at footage coming out of Avdiivka, that I'm looking at a destroyed Russian Bradley or a destroyed Ukrainian T-90M. And when equipment is sufficiently distinct like that, it's just easier to make sure that you're correctly categorizing losses onto either side. Okay, so if Avdiivka is easier to assess than a battle like Bakhmut, what is the data we're receiving so far showing us? And I'll start by just trying to put this whole thing into the perspective of the wider war. What you're looking at here are the proportional loss statistics for different system types across the entire war so far. So if the graph for tanks shows 90% Russians, for example, that means for every 10 tanks lost in Ukraine, 9 of them have been Russian. The way this is calculated is looking at the number of destroyed, abandoned, and captured vehicles for each side. So that means removing the damage category entirely, because you're never quite certain how many vehicles are going to return to service. And then for each side, I reduce the observed loss by 30% of the number of vehicles they've captured from their opponent. So the assumption here is that if you're Ukraine, you need to capture a little over 3 Russian BMP-1s, for example, in order to put 1 BMP-1 of your own into service. Put that all together and you get an indicative calculated loss ratio across certain systems. So looking on the screen there, you can see that Russia has lost a bit over 4 tanks for every Ukrainian one, a bit over 9 MLRS systems for every Ukrainian one, while for surface-to-air missile systems, the ratio is much closer to 6-4. Obviously, most of these ratios are massively in Ukraine's favour, and that might go some way towards explaining why a force with such a significant pre-war material disadvantage has been able to leverage that equipment and what it's received from its allies to slow down, stop, and then often seize the initiative against the invading Russian force. A key here, however, is that a lot of those statistics reflect primarily defensive actions being fought by the Ukrainians and major Russian disasters like the retreat from Kyiv or the collapse in Kharkiv, both of which handed large amounts of captured equipment into Ukrainian hands. Attacking into prepared defensive positions is obviously a very different proposition, and the statistics reflect that. So if you narrow the losses you're looking at just to those visually confirmed lost in Zaporizhzhia between the beginning of the Ukrainian counteroffensive this year and November 17, the picture in most categories becomes significantly less favourable for Ukraine. As a side note, my thanks have to go to Twitter user NalCO26 here for compiling the geolocated visually confirmed losses. Look just at this region where the Ukrainian offensive was focused, and suddenly you have a rough parity in AFE losses and in engineering vehicle losses. Meanwhile, the shift in tank losses is nowhere near as significant. You're still almost looking at a 4-to-1 loss ratio, but it certainly isn't as good as the statistics for the war as a whole. And you know what? I understand that there will be people who look at those statistics suggesting Ukraine was still trading positively across a lot of equipment categories despite being the attacker, and start hitting X to doubt while reposting this image 730 times. Because in the first days and weeks of the Ukrainian offensive, also the most mechanized stage of the offensive, Ukraine did expose a lot of Bradleys, Leopards, supporting engineering vehicles, etc. to enemy fire, and got a lot of them knocked out in minefields by enemy artillery, ATGMs, attack helicopters, etc. And that is absolutely reflected in the data we have. Narrow the date range just for the offensive up to June 17 in Zaporizhzhia, and the data showed that when Ukraine did try and push through the Russian minefields and prepare defences using a mechanized force, they lost about as many tanks as the Russians, more AFVs than the Russians, as well as a significant number of infantry mobility vehicles, MRAPs, and engineering vehicles. If you're interested in what that looks like in absolute terms, so count of vehicles rather than proportions, looking at just destroyed or abandoned vehicles, there are your figures. 15 Ukrainian tanks, 5 engineering vehicles, more than 35 infantry mobility vehicles and MRAPs, and a significant number of AFVs, including M2 Bradleys for good measure. What happened after this point was Ukraine began to significantly change the tactics that it was using during the offensive, which admittedly slowed down progress significantly, but also equalised and then actually gave the Ukrainians an advantage in visually confirmed vehicle losses. The general rule I hear that an attacker has to lose 3 times more material than a defender just doesn't work. Who is attacking, who is defending, the relative combat power, the terrain involved, and dozens of other factors, including the tactics being employed, all obviously matter. But what I think we can observe here, whether we're talking about the initial or the later stages of the Ukrainian southern offensive, is that whatever tactics and techniques were being employed, losses were still significantly higher than they tended to be in defensive operations or the war as a whole. The slower moving approach appears to have only delivered results marginally better than 1-to-1 in some equipment categories. Yes, there is obviously a massive caveat there, especially around equipment that hasn't been geolocated and thus not included. But the point stands that when Ukraine tries to go forward into the teeth of the heaviest Russian defences, as opposed to, for example, what we saw with the successes at Kharkiv, Kherson, or Kyiv, it clearly needs to be willing to expend material to do so, which is obviously a problem for Ukraine as long as Russia has more stuff. The fact is, deliveries from Ukraine's allies haven't kept pace with the amount of stuff Russia has been able to reactivate out of storage, and increasingly is able to produce or modernise in its factories. So for Ukraine to win an ongoing war of material attrition, it doesn't just need campaigns where it tries to take ground at something close to an even exchange rate, it needs there to be battles and engagements with favourable rates of attrition, while what Russia needs to do is not Leroy Jenkins' entire division's worth of material directly into the furnace. But then again, Valery Gerasimov is still in charge of the Russian military, and so we got the Battle of Avdiivka. And this is what the statistics look like for Avdiivka after just over a month of Russian offensive actions. A greater than 9-to-1 ratio for tanks, between 20 and 30-to-1 for AFVs, greater than a 4-to-1 ratio for self-propelled artillery, and to the great chagrin of calculators and machine spirits everywhere, a divide-by-zero error when looking at engineering vehicles. Even by the standards of the war as a whole, accounting as they are for the distortions caused by the disasters at Kyiv or Kharkiv, those ratios are absolutely abysmal for Russia's mechanised forces, and go far beyond any sort of margin Russia might hope to maintain due to its greater amount of reserved or produced equipment. Here what you're looking at are the numbers expressed in absolute terms, showing that not just are the ratios pretty skewed when you're talking about tanks or armoured fighting vehicles, the absolute figures are pretty shocking given the size and scale of the objective and give some clue as to just how many troops were involved. For 24 November, the total for destroyed and abandoned, so not counting captured, Russian tanks was 81. The total for armoured fighting vehicles, more than 145, and the total for specialised engineering vehicles, a much more humble 6. At those rates of loss, just fighting the Battle of Avdiivka with no other engagements anywhere else along the line is so expensive in tanks and armoured fighting vehicles that the UK's armoured force of Challenger 2s and Warrior IFVs would be basically wiped out in a matter of months, taking those casualty rates. Expressed another way, if the Battle of Avdiivka was fought full-time at this rate of average intensity, then even if Dmitry Medvedev was telling the truth about Russian tank production and restoration capacity, then very roughly half of those 1,500 new and restored tanks would be required just to keep up with the rate of losses around Avdiivka. I've often seen the fighting at Avdiivka compared to that around Bakhmut. And to be fair, I do see the parallels, Ukraine holding on to an urban centre, Russia trying to encircle it, followed by a grinding attritional battle to try and slowly nibble it apart piece by piece while cutting off its supply routes. But in terms of materiel losses compared to territory gained, I think another valid comparison might be Vuhledar, because I'd argue that was another example of Russia proving that it can't really bring all the pieces of a mechanised offensive together in order to efficiently break into a Ukrainian defensive position without taking truly abysmal casualties. Now, I'd obviously accept and actively remind everyone that there's a degree of uncertainty here. We don't know what the balance of dismounted infantry casualties is, for example, and I'm sure the situation for Ukrainians in Avdiivka itself is probably extremely difficult. But the amount of burning Russian materiel and consumed combat power that we see around Avdiivka is something the Russian military probably can't ignore, even if they choose to accept it, because every tank or BMP burned here is one that can't be deployed somewhere else. And while the pool of available equipment is extensive, it is not unlimited. Another interesting exercise I thought I might do here is comparing what we can see in the visually confirmed loss data with what we're getting out of official government sources. If you've followed my videos for a while, you know I don't really use official Ukrainian or Russian statistics. Russian statistics because they are absurd to the point of literally being impossible in several equipment categories, while the Ukrainian figures I avoid because even though they don't have the same collection of Konashenkov specials as the Russians do, I still believe that, like almost every force in history, they have a tendency towards overclaiming. The question, however, is how much might they be overclaiming by? And what the Battle of Avdiivka gave us is an ability to make a somewhat like-for-like comparison for once between official Ukrainian statistics and what we can see in the visually confirmed data. And that's because on November 6th, the Ukrainians claimed they had destroyed 100 Russian tanks and 250 other armoured fighting vehicles over the 3 weeks to that date in the Avdiivka area. Meanwhile, we have visually confirmed loss statistics for the Avdiivka area to 2 different dates. The 3rd of November, slightly before the Ukrainian release, and the 10th of November, slightly after it. Compare those 2 sets of figures and we have 100 tanks claimed by the Ukrainians against either 57 or 61 visually confirmed depending on the date. That gives us a ratio of between 1.64 and 1.75 to 1, meaning that for every Russian tank we have proof was destroyed or abandoned, the Ukrainians claim between 1.64 and 1.75. Expressed another way, for every tank the Ukrainians claim, we have proof for about 0.6 of 1. The figures for other armoured vehicles are also roughly in that same ballpark. 250 claimed by the Ukrainians against 141 or 159 visually confirmed depending on the date. That gives a ratio of between 1.57 and 1.77, meaning again, for every armoured vehicle the Ukrainians claim, we have proof of about 60% of 1. Now, to me acting as an analyst, there are a couple of things about those figures that stand out. Firstly, the ratio for different vehicle types, tanks versus AFVs, is actually relatively close together, which might suggest, noting a very small sample size here, that Ukrainian claims are at least correlated with the losses that we can visually confirm, and they're not just metaphorically throwing darts at a board in order to figure out how many vehicles they're going to claim. I'd also suggest that given what we're comparing here, those ratios are actually really tight. While there are obviously error pressures in both directions for visually confirmed losses, there are reasons you can have numbers that are too high or too low. I've explained before in the past why, on balance, I think visually confirmed losses tend to be overly conservative. It relies on every loss being visually documented, reported, and then tracked. In this case, we also have the issue of equipment not being accurately geolocated. Meanwhile, historically, we would expect everyone from troops up to the highest level of commanders to overclaim. Whether out of confusion, optimism, self-promotion, or 100 other factors, you would expect even a relatively robust official claiming system to give a number that was somewhat high. And so all things considered, I think a spread of 1.57 to 1.77 is actually pretty tight. And if I had to put down money on where the actual number lay, it would be between those 2 figures. There are obviously limits to how far we can draw lessons from this particular exercise, but particularly for those of you who regularly interact with Ukrainian official statistics, I thought you might find this exercise interesting. The final way I wanted to cut the data here was to show those relative loss ratios for tanks, armoured fighting vehicles, and self-propelled guns, but split up across those various campaigns. So for each category you see on the screen here, each bar represents the number of Russian vehicles visually confirmed lost per Ukrainian one, for, moving from left to right, the early stages of the Zaporizhzhia offensive, the total of the Zaporizhzhia offensive, the Battle of Avdiivka, and the entire war. And what I think that pretty clearly visually demonstrates is that particularly for the Russian mechanized forces, that is the infantry fighting vehicles and the tanks, Zaporizhzhia was an opportunity to start trading on a slightly more even basis with their Ukrainian opponent, while Avdiivka has very much been a return to the classics of 2022, and a loss ratio that makes Pickett's Charge or the final scenes of The Last Samurai look like sensible military maneuvers. So are there any closing observations we can make about the losses at Avdiivka and any of these other battles and their relevance to the wider war? Because no matter what statistical source you use and how well visually evidenced each individual entry might be, this is still war and there are entirely reasonable objections that people might raise. And so my final thoughts here are going to be trying to reconcile what we're seeing in this data to what we see in the war as a whole. Because there are, for example, pro-Ukrainian sources that claim even better loss ratios than I've examined here, while on the pro-Russian side there are some that assert that Ukraine is actually losing more stuff than Russia is, and that everything is still presumably going according to Russia's broader attritional plan. To try and address those and explain why Avdiivka, Kherson, places like that might matter, there are three, hopefully non-controversial assumptions I want to make. The first is that having more material doesn't necessarily guarantee victory. Tactics, morale, force quality, and 100 other factors matter as well. But in this kind of hard attritional fighting, material certainly helps. And if you want to keep fighting, whether attacking or defending, you're going to need stuff. Point 2 is that Russia began the war with more stuff than Ukraine. And point 3 is that Russia has been able to pull more ammunition, vehicles, and other material out of storage or from other sources than Ukraine has likely received from its allies. And what I'd suggest that if Russia was constantly enjoying a positive rate of attrition against Ukraine and specifically against Ukraine's stock of material, all those HIMARS they've destroyed, for example, then logically speaking, Russia's advantage in these various areas must increase over time. Which is why you might see sources that put forward those sort of pro-Russian estimates constantly predicting the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces. In a sense, they sort of have to, because it's the natural logical result of what they're saying is happening. But obviously, the Ukrainian military hasn't collapsed in 2022 or 2023 and is still able to obtain local initiative on parts of the front while doing a lot of damage fighting on the defensive in others, which puts reality and those estimates in direct conflict. And whenever reality and an estimate clash, it's the estimate that's going to end up knocked out on the car park pavement. By contrast, if some of the most optimistic pro-Ukrainian estimates were true, then the battlefield outcomes would probably be less balanced than what we observe. We probably would have expected more results out of the Zaporizhzhia push, and for Russia not to have enough resources to feel confident launching the attack it's launched at Avdiivka. So reality, I'd suggest, is probably somewhere in the middle, but much closer to the Ukrainian estimates than the Russian ones. Ukraine has been able to fight an often attritional war with Russia despite having significantly less material, in part because it has consistently been able to maintain a positive exchange rate of its material for Russia's. That suggests that in order to maintain or improve its position and to be able to launch offensive actions, and to launch offensive operations where, for example, losses might temporarily get much closer to 1-to-1 or even negative for Ukraine, you could argue that Ukraine really needs battles like Vuhledar or Avdiivka, fights where the material attrition is brutal, difficult, but ultimately very one-sided. And while Avdiivka would be a significant prize if the Russians managed to secure it, it may be the kind of success that comes at exactly the sort of cost that Russia may regret further down the line. So with all that talk about losses and their significance covered, let's zoom back out and look at the way the fighting itself has looked. What are some of the adaptations we're noticing, and what might their implications be going forward? Because however slowly territory is changing hands overall, I'd argue that's not because the fighting is steady state and nothing is changing, but rather because both sides are changing, adapting, introducing new technologies and making innovations as quickly as possible, and that it's actually the balance between those adaptations, as well as the nature of the war we see being fought, that serves to at least sort of keep the line steady while the attritional conflict plays out. I know I've recently done 2 videos on game changers, so I won't dwell for too long here, but if you just want to talk about a couple of Russian systems and trends, I'd note the increasing deployment of smaller electronic warfare systems intended to protect individual vehicles or sections of trench line, the continuation and expansion of Russia's glide bombing campaign, which gives Russian aircraft the means to deliver very heavy ordnance moderately precisely against Ukrainian positions, and provides at least one mechanism which the Russians can use to compensate for local logistical difficulties or issues obtaining artillery superiority, because even if you can't deliver enough shells to your guns, perhaps you can have an aircraft dispatch a ton of high explosives in the general direction of your opponent. And then finally, I'd note reports of Russian attack helicopters besides the Kamov-52s deploying some of Russia's more capable, longer-ranged ATGMs. In some ways, these are pretty basal to the ability of the attack helicopters to make a contribution moderately safely. Because while in the earlier stages of the war, attacking safely usually meant lobbing unguided rockets at an area code of choice, long-range ATGMs can give helicopters a means to engage targets beyond the range of Ukrainian short-ranged air defences. One of the rarer but more capable systems that's been reported in use here is the LMUR ATGM. Now you can argue the L in that name is a little bit deceptive since it stands for light, and yet in part the missile achieves its range and performance characteristics through the typical Russian design approach of just having a chonker of a form factor. This is an ATGM that weighs more than 100 kilos, more than twice an American Hellfire, but that means it can deliver a 25 kilogram warhead out past 14 kilometers. With that sort of reach, even an older attack helicopter, provided it has the optics necessary to spot and acquire a target, might have the ability to considerably outrange most Ukrainian short-range air defense systems. We saw this missile originally being used in the middle of 2022, but with Ukrainian air defences having partially adapted to the attack helicopter threat, while in turn the Russian attack helicopter fleet has faced a little bit of pressure from things like ATACMS, even the small numbers of missiles like this that might be available provide a means to help the Russians get more out of the platforms they still have available. The Ukrainians too have seen new systems hit the field and others be telegraphed. We've already talked about ATACMS pretty extensively, and so far as teasers go, it was reported that the most recent US aid package to Ukraine included a single additional HIMARS system, which may have gone through some special modifications. The core problem, as is often the case for Ukraine, is not so much that new technologies aren't useful or effective, but simply that they often aren't made available quickly enough or in sufficient quantities to have the effect they could have. Perhaps the most rapid rate of adaptation continues to be in the utilisation of drones. Here, I want to be careful about how much I say until it's time to do a specific video on the topic, but for now, here's a little bit of a terrifying TLDR. As artillery shell and other munition shortages become acute again, the role of FPV and strike drones has continued to increase. The designs are continuing to evolve, becoming more lethal, more survivable, and more likely to hit their targets, all else being equal. Production quantities continue to increase, Ukraine reporting about 15,000 FPVs now being produced per month, and the tactics and support systems that enable these drones to be used effectively continue to develop too, meaning that even as we've seen continuous focus placed on the counter-UAS role both in Ukraine and Russia, the rate of observed FPV strikes holds steady or in some areas significantly increases. Plus, while it's been interesting to see a number of conferences or discussions around AI or autonomous weapon systems in recent months, no one fighting in Ukraine for either side seems to have gotten their invitation, and so the way things are going in Ukraine, you're going to see Pavel and his mates code up the Slavic alpha version of Skynet's drone-flying cousin and leverage it for drone warfare, with Russia more or less doing the same. Improved autonomy delivers real advantages in the Ukrainian context, and so I suspect we're probably just going to see more and more of it. Moving away from just systems and technology, it's also been interesting to observe how some Ukrainian and Russian units have been redeployed and continue to evolve. You may recall that in the lead up to and during the Ukrainian offensive, the decision to give some of the best NATO-supplied equipment to relatively new Ukrainian units was just a bit controversial. Some of those units would then go on to really struggle during the offensive, trying to fight their way through Russian defences in what was basically their first major engagements as a unit. But if you first started fighting in June, and it's now late November, you're not exactly a new unit anymore. To give an example of a particularly famous Ukrainian unit that's now probably gone through that transition, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade was one of the units specifically prepared for the Ukrainian offensive, and it was given some of the best equipment Ukraine had available, a mixture of Leopard 2 tanks supporting American Bradleys. That unit subsequently had a really hard time, particularly during the earlier stages of the offensive. They were the ones in that famous photo of Leopards and Bradleys knocked out in a field. And in the course of trying to fight through those Russian defences, they lost a lot of people, a lot of equipment, and there were a fair number of recriminations shared publicly in some cases about the whole thing. Recently, however, the 47th hasn't been fighting in Zaporizhzhia, they've been at Avdiivka. That's no great operational secret, the Russians call the unit out by number and name in their regular reports, and when you're watching geolocated footage, you can't exactly paint up a Leopard to look like a T-72. You can try and match the colour and the fashion, but in the end the extra 20 tonnes are going to show somewhere. In June, the 47th was a relatively new unit trying to take its NATO hardware straight through Russian minefields. Cut forward to later in November, and the 47th is probably now a more experienced unit, using NATO tanks that were primarily designed to fight mostly defensive battles to repel attacks by Soviet mechanized forces, in order to, you guessed it, fight mostly defensive battles against attacks by Russian mechanized forces. The 47th has, again, taken losses as a result. We saw a Leopard 2 knocked out in early November from memory, but as we saw in the data earlier, the relative results are complete night and day when compared to June. In other words, there might be some evidence for units adapting, learning, and developing the hard way, following the historically observed trajectory of deployed units becoming more and more capable, until they reach a point of exhaustion and fatigue and effectiveness rapidly drops off. It's generally understood that the armies fighting in Ukraine still have a long way to go in terms of training standards, the ability to coordinate, and to overcome military cultural issues and the Soviet legacy. But lessons in some cases do seem to get learned, at least right up until the point where Gerasimov or someone similar has a bright idea again. Meanwhile, if you want to look for some higher level observations we might make as a result of the recent offensives, there are a couple that I think stand out. Firstly, it's clear that after a year of relatively high tempo operations, exhaustion and supply depletion is obviously a factor on both sides. The Ukrainians had stockpiled artillery ammunition to support their offensive in the south, but with a lot of those reserves committed and with delivery targets from places like the European Union very publicly not being hit, anecdotal evidence suggests that shell hunger is once again very much a factor. Russian logistical difficulties often also manifest, usually at a local level on specific parts of the front, and both sides are increasingly depending on alternatives, things like FPV drones or glide bombs. In part, it seems to compensate for a slackening in available artillery supply. In terms of force quality and objectives, Russia still very clearly, I think, has offensive ambitions. Because while it is possible to explain actions like the ones at Avdiivka as, for example, distractions or fixing actions, they're just so incredibly expensive compared to the potential result achieved, that it would be hard to understand why they continue to launch those sort of attacks if they don't value the territory itself. And just as Avdiivka probably shows that Russia still wants to move forward, I think it also shows Russia is still struggling to find a model of offensive action that works, that isn't either completely levelling the objective with 60,000 rounds a day of artillery fire the way they did at Popasna in 2022, for example, or throwing men and material at the problem in order to move forward metre by metre. Russia's last major offensive success was arguably Bakhmut, something which essentially blunted Wagner as an offensive force, unless you count the Moscow road trip. Avdiivka isn't taken yet, and the fact that it will be taken isn't certain, and yet the disparity in costs for Russia to move forward there have been so great that even accounting for Russian advantages in recruitable manpower or material, it just isn't a sustainable, scalable solution for future offensives. And based on the material loss data we have from Kherson, noting we can't account for human losses, it seems that even if Russian defences are very capable of holding on stubbornly, they burn a significant amount of resources in relative terms while doing so, which leads us into some final reason guesswork as to the state and capabilities of the two armies. Because in an attritional war like this, it isn't just lines on the map that matter, it's what the fighting to move those lines is doing to the two forces involved. What I'd argue we saw this year was that Ukraine took the combat power it had accumulated, even if it was well short of what it said it needed, and was able to seize the initiative on the southern front and make some impression against the most heavily defended parts of the Russian line. After the initial shock, they were able to even out the loss rates in materiel, but they didn't have the combat power to both fight in a way that minimised losses and get them to Tokmak. By contrast, Russia through the kitchen sink at Avdiivka did make an impression on the Ukrainian line, but at what appears to have been a tremendous cost in men and materiel. That suggests that even though there are reportedly continuing issues in the Ukrainian army, issues, for example, of a shortage of officers, difficulty in communication, or having officers that still come from the Soviet school and as a result are a little too willing to expend men and materiel, Ukraine has still been able to be more efficient to generate more combat power using the resources it has available than Russia has with its nominally superior resources. That's resulted in a sort of balance where neither side has enough of an advantage to overcome the inherent advantages a defender enjoys in this sort of fighting, and so the result has been continuing attrition, adaptation, and a race to both regenerate and generate new forces in order to put one side or the other in a position of sufficient advantage to actually regain some sort of offensive momentum. That was basically one of the core messages when Valery Zaluzhny, when he published his article in The Economist in early November. The general made comparisons between current battlefield conditions in Ukraine and the First World War, saying that the net effect of the various technologies available and the resource limitations that Ukraine was operating under had pushed the war into being a fight that was both attritional and positional. He identified a range of capabilities ranging from air power to mine clearing to electronic warfare that he felt Ukraine would need supplied by its allies in order to gain a sufficient advantage to avoid efforts to go forward against Russian defences becoming slow-moving or stalemated, with the implication being that in the absence of those sort of capabilities, the fighting would probably remain positional. From a resource and inputs perspective, that's not a stable state of affairs. It's an ugly attritional struggle where Ukraine wants more weeks like the first week of the Russian offensive at Avdiivka, and where Russia really just wants Ukraine's backers to give up and go home. You could describe the current balance as a stalemate, but it's also kind of like two blokes having a competition to see who can hold their breath underwater for longer. Yes, at any given moment, they still might be in the game, but eventually, someone's going to have to come up for air first. And who that is in Ukraine probably depends on a range of factors, including politics, aid, battlefield developments, and the way the other aspects of the military and missile campaign are expected to evolve over winter. But that, I think, is ultimately a topic for another day. Because while critical issues like ongoing US military aid to Ukraine or financial assistance from the European Union are being debated, in Ukraine the fighting continues, and winter is very much coming. In conclusion, even though the best campaigning weather in Ukraine is now long past, fighting very much continues at multiple locations along the front. And while attacks and counterattacks continuously develop along the line, it's clear both sides have attempted to take and control the initiative in different areas. For Ukraine, that might mean continuing operations in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, while for Russia, the results of the ongoing and very expensive push against Avdiivka have yet to be determined. And while it's not yet certain whether Avdiivka will hold or Ukraine will ultimately be forced to withdraw, the fierce fighting we've seen across these various operations, I think, demonstrates one thing clearly. Both of these armies, despite suffering from exhaustion and losses, still clearly have a lot of fight left in them, as the grinding attritional struggle continues, and both forces prepare for the challenges that winter will bring. And on that happy note, I do have a channel update to close out. Firstly, I imagine a lot of you saw my community post, but for those of you who missed it, one of the things I want to do to say thank you for all the support I've received over the course of this year is to do a little extra segment in December, the exact shape of which I haven't exactly decided on yet, where I try to address some questions from primarily patrons but also regular subscribers in basically a sort of Q&A format. So if you do have a question or have an interest in which ones get selected, either jump over to that community post or put your question in the comments to this video and throw a like against any question you're particularly interested in seeing responded to, because that's one way in which I'll prioritise which ones I decide to include. In terms of upcoming release schedule, the schedule for December is now pretty much set and hopefully shouldn't be disrupted by any movements up to the holiday period. At least 2 of those 4 releases will be topics related to Ukraine, while another will hopefully be the long-awaited release of the video on India. Now, one of the things I'm looking to do for that video is commission professionally done translation subtitles. The problem I have often had with translations, however, is I have no way of verifying whether or not they are accurate, and usually when I have asked different speakers to check each other's work, they have disagreed on the translation, making it difficult for me to use it. So if you are an English and Hindi speaking fan of the channel and you might be interested in sense checking whatever translation I receive back, please send me an email and I may or may not ask for your help in December. Finally, it is also my hope in December to maybe do at least a small-scale resurrection of the Purin Gaming channel, which has been on hiatus for about 6 months now. I'm not sure exactly what that will look like just yet, but I hope to have more news next week. Until then, I'd like to wish you all the very best. Thank you, and of course this week's sponsor, for your ongoing support, and say that I hope to see you all again next week.